Topic of today's satsang is, who am I? Because of the way that we've come to see life and see who we are through a set of beliefs, and that we see life as a linear progression based on cause and effect. When a question is presented, we try to answer the question using our mind. But this particular question, who am I, doesn't have an answer. Doesn't have an answer that we can write down. Doesn't have an answer that we can put into words. The answer to the question, who am I, is our being. This place of being is found outside of the mind. And because from a very young age, the only way that we've known ourselves is through an idea of ourselves, and because from a very young age we have interpreted life through that idea of ourselves, basically judged whatever has happened as either good or bad relative to this idea of ourselves, we sometimes don't even know that there is this space outside of thinking where our true being actually resides. And so that's why this is such an important part of spiritual seeking and the pointers for spiritual seekers. That is to say that there is a zone, there is a place of being which is outside of the mind. And it's only in that place of being that we find who and what we truly are. We know it by being it. We know it at no distance. It is not something that we perceive and know it as being something that is outside of ourselves. We actually know it because we are it. So it's not a knowing in the head, not a knowing of words, but a being. And this place of being is not dependent on thinking. In fact, it's thinking that keeps us out of that place of being. So why is it that this place of being where I am, where we know ourselves, is sometimes not even recognized to be there, not even known to exist? The reason that that's the case is because this experience of life, this creation, has been created for that forgetting to happen. It has been forced upon the experience. The identification with thought, identification with a body, which is just an object, has been forced to happen. And while that identification is happening, then that place of being is obscured. What identification really means is that a set of beliefs, a set of thoughts, have established themselves. And those are thoughts that say what I am, a belief about who I am. They're not actually what I am, but a belief which is inaccurate, a belief about who I am and what life is. And the belief about who I am and what life is completely inaccurate compared to what life really is and who I really am. The belief effectively says that I am this body, that is part of the flow of life, and that the flow of life, pleasure and pain, as it hits me, either adds to me or takes away from me. when this belief is in place, life is very often a threat to who we are, a threat to who we believe ourselves to be. This idea of who we are, this false set of beliefs about who we are, is where all suffering stems from. Suffering really in its most basic form is a fear of death. And when we have a false belief of who we are, attached to those set of beliefs is the idea that I can die. So all of the pain that is part of the flow of life is effectively seen as a mini death, an attack on who I am. And therefore, the flow of life, pain, has to be resisted by the idea of who we are. We are sometimes told that we should accept life. Acceptance is not something that can happen when there is an idea of who I am that is threatened by life. If that was the case, if I have an idea of who I am that is threatened by the flow of life, threatened by pain in the moment, then that idea has to react to life. That belief, that set of beliefs of who I am, has to react to life in a resisting way. It can't happen any other way, and therefore non-acceptance is generally what happens when this idea of who we are exists. This is actually great news because it explains why there is so much suffering in life. And it also suggests that in the absence of this belief of who we are, what we really are might be something very different. What we really are might know that it's not threatened by the flow of life. So the idea of who we are is based on the experience as it's presented itself to date. So it's not an accident that this idea of who we are has been put in place. It's actually been supported by the evidence as it presents itself moment after moment. It's been supported by the way that the experience in the moment has been created to be experienced, how it's been created to be felt. And that is that in the moment the experience says, yes, what I am is a body. And so the belief is formed. Life puts in place the experience and the false beliefs. And as a result of life having put in place the false beliefs of who we are, life also puts in place the resistance to the flow of life. The suffering, the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, and the expectation. And at some point, life starts to dissolve those beliefs about who we are. Spiritual teachings are one way in which life starts to dissolve the belief in who we are. We are told that we are not the body. We might hear that what we are is formless. What we are is ever present and unchanging. What we are is invulnerable and not threatened by the flow of life. What we are was never born and will never die. Now, for us to hear this is not really enough. Life also needs to conspire for the message to penetrate deeper. This message needs to start attacking the false belief about who we are. Simultaneously, we might start to find this place of being presenting itself. A place that starts to demonstrate the accuracy of these statements. In the place of being, the body sensations and feelings can fall away. It can be apparent that the awareness, which is aware of the momentary experience, is prior to the body. That the awareness doesn't stem from the body. That the body is actually arising inside of awareness. So if thinking is what gets in the way of our being, if our being exists before thinking, if our being is not something that we have to think into existence, but rather drop into when thinking stops, how can this ending of thinking come about? So we hear that thinking, obsessive thinking about what we need in the future, what happened in the past, obsessive thinking about what is happening in the present, gets in the way of our being. And so often we take that as an instruction of something to do. I have to stop thinking. So what do? We close our eyes and we tell ourselves to stop thinking, which is simply another thought, more thinking. This isn't as bad as it sounds, because if we do this and awareness lands on the fact that in us trying to control thinking, we're simply adding more thinking to the load and creating an ongoing obstruction to our being. If awareness becomes aware of this happening, the brain can suddenly realize, oh, I just have to stop. So, two of the great Advaita teachers of the 20th century, Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj, and the core of their teachings both revolve around coming to know oneself. In fact, all non-dual teachings are pointing to the self that is, pointing to the present moment where everything just is, and we know that we exist undeniably. But to see that Nisargadatta's suggested practice is to abide in I am. At the end, it isn't a practice. It is where we are. It is natural. It's not something that we have to practice and become good at. But because a habit has been put in place that keeps us away from home, for a while there needs to be what looks like practice. And so abide in I am is simply a concept that is presented to the seeker, becomes part of their up-to-date conditioning, part of their makeup. And what it says is, if you find yourself moving through the day and you become aware of thinking happening, abide in I am. What that really means is recognize that the thinking, although somewhere in the system we believe it to be helpful, is actually what gets in the way of us knowing ourselves. So the statement to abide in I am is simply a reminder, when it is seen that thinking is happening obsessively, to just stop. Abide in I am. We can even just say the words, I am, full stop. And when we get to the full stop, it means to be. So I am becomes the final thought before being. So we can be in the middle of thinking about what we need to do in order to be successful and happy. And if awareness recognizes that this thinking about what we need in the future to be happening is happening, it realizes that this is not actually good for me. I'm never going to find an answer. I'm never going to find my happiness in this thinking. And so it can stop midstream. And the thought I am spontaneously arises and stops the thinking midstream. And at the end of the am, there's a full stop. And that's our opportunity to just be. At first, when we practice this abiding in I am, we might find that the thinking stops for a millisecond. And before we know it, it starts again. And it might be minutes or hours before we realize that our attempt to abide in I am lasted for half a second. But that's okay, because as soon as awareness lands on the fact that the thinking has started again, I am. And as we do this throughout the day, we could do it 20, 30, 40, 50 times. And it doesn't have to happen for more than a second or two each time. But as we do it, we become more and more familiar with the fact that there is a ground of being that exists outside of my thinking. This could be a radical surprise to us. If we don't ever hear that this place of being exists, it's unlikely that life will ever include a realization of self, a realization of what we truly are in essence, prior to the body. And in knowing what we are in this present moment, prior to the body, we come to know what we are prior to the manifestation. We'll never be able to experience that, because what exists prior to the manifestation is consciousness at rest. Consciousness that's not even aware of itself. In being, there is an awareness of consciousness. consciousness becomes aware of itself, and as a result there is a self-contenting peace that pervades through the moment. Consciousness at rest, which is prior to the manifestation, doesn't even know it exists. It is not aware of itself. So we can never know that state, but by knowing what we are as consciousness in the manifestation, that becomes the bridge between the unmanifest and the personal consciousness. The I am is the point in between impersonal consciousness and the personal expression of the human being. To the extent that our awareness doesn't land on this place of being, it is assumed that the consciousness belongs to the body, that the consciousness stems from the body, which means that it's believed that the body is a separate, independent entity that is doing everything on its own, and that becomes the idea of who we are. I am this body that is separate from everything else, is not connected to anything, and that this body must be the entity that I am. This body is the source of the consciousness that functions through it. This is a radically wrong idea about who we are. It is the idea that keeps us disconnected from Source. What the human being really is impersonal consciousness, identified to a particular body and functioning through that body as a vehicle. And when impersonal consciousness functions through that body as a vehicle, it then presents itself as the personal consciousness that is colored by the characteristics of the body. That becomes the Rogerness. But what comes into Roger is free of personality, free of characteristics. And it's that consciousness that comes in that moves through Roger and directs all of the actions that happen through Roger and in fact through everyone else. Come to know ourself for what we really are. Come to know the human being for what it really is. And then we come to know every other human being as being the same. So what is Roger? Roger is the combination of impersonal consciousness that has no characteristics, coming directly from Source, that has linked itself to a particular body-mind organism and is functioning through that body-mind organism as the way of knowing itself and knowing life. But for a while, the vehicle is forced to adopt some false ideas about what life really is and what is really happening here. And those false ideas that the vehicle adopts as part of the conditioning that life puts into it, those beliefs obscure our true nature. And that's meant to happen. It's meant to happen in order for us to forget our essence and identify with something that we're not, a physical being, and to see life as something it isn't, an objective reality. And at some point, the conditioning in the vehicle, the thoughts in the vehicle, start to get attacked by life. Life conspires to dissolve certain conditioning in the vehicle. That conditioning we can call the sense of personal doership, and it all resides in the thinking mind. So life conspires to dissolve the conditioning in the thinking mind. And when that happens, the working mind continues to function. The working mind doesn't include false ideas of who we are. the working mind is part of the biological makeup of the body rather than the psychological conditioning that is part of the thinking mind. And the biological makeup, the working mind, is required in order for us to live the rest of our life. So language is a form of conditioning that exists in the working mind. Our capacity to know how to walk is conditioning that exists in the working mind. Our mathematic capacity, our understanding of how to hold a knife and fork, all of that is conditioning that bears no problem and doesn't cover up who we truly are. None of that conditioning creates suffering. It's only the conditioning in the thinking mind, which is conditioning that says, I am this body, this separate entity walking through an objective reality in control of what I do in each moment, and therefore that thinking sees the other as a separate entity in control of what they do. And that is the separation. That is the grounds on which we see the other as a competitor or an enemy. That's the grounds on which we feel vulnerable and open to attack in any moment. That's the grounds on which we feel like we have to defend and take at the expense of the other in order to boost what we are through material gain. So as these false beliefs dissolve, this attitude to the other starts to dissolve with it. The other is no longer seen as an independent entity in control of everything that happens. Life is seen to be far less personal than we used to see it. It's known to be an experience that arises in the moment and is recognized by the essence of what we are, recognized by the awareness and the consciousness that we are. And so when the flow of life delivers pain, that is seen to be what it really is, which is pain in the moment. It is accepted as part of the flow of life, accepted as part of the creation in that moment, accepted to be my destiny. And it's also accepted that it's the destiny of the other as part of the creation in that moment to deliver the pain in that moment. From that point of view, we're no longer competitors and enemies, but rather we're in this together, and everything that is happening according to God's will. And God's will now is not as devastating as it used to be when I believed myself to be an entity that could be killed, an entity that could have part of itself taken away by the other. So as that falls away, God's will becomes much less of a threat to who I am. God's will being what happens in the flow of life, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And in fact, God's will and my will are no longer seen as separate. In the moment, I can do exactly what I feel like doing. I can move to the right, move to the left. But it's known that whatever I choose in the moment, which feels like my free will, feels like my choice, is known to actually be coming from Source, from God, an unfolding of the predestined story of life. So pleasure gets to be enjoyed. Pain is accepted as part of the duality of life. And what I am remains complete, whole, and unaffected by whatever exists in the present moment. Whatever flow of life, be it pleasure or pain, exists in the present moment. All I want is peace of mind. I don't mind how I get it. If peace of mind will come from the ending of thinking, then the mind actually doesn't want to get in the way. It just doesn't know any better until it becomes conditioned to know better. So when it realizes for itself that actually it can never know what is prior to mind, it actually then has the information to stop.
Mm.
And then something can be known. So the gateway to knowing is not knowing. Now, the not knowing is what the mind comes to understand. The mind says, I don't know anything, actually, when it comes to the nature of reality. I can't know anything because I am after the ground of reality. And so,
Yes.
at some point, this not knowing is wisdom functioning. But we can't stop there, because this is not a search. It's not a journey of not knowing. It's a journey of knowing oneself. It's not a journey of not knowing oneself. That's where we start off. And so the gateway to knowing, which is a knowing that is not a mental knowing, a mind knowing, the gateway is to realize I don't know. And then we find ourselves in this place of being where, without doubt, there is the answer to the question, who am I? In the being.
Mm.
So simple.